Okay, so we want to have a look really and remind ourselves how the First World War contributes to the abdication of the Tsar by March 1917. So think about think about doing a health check on Russia in 1914 and think about where the strengths and weaknesses lie. We've got a country that's still an autocracy. We've got a country where the majority of people are still peasants, many of them former serfs. We've got a country that doesn't have a large middle class. It's growing as a result of the reforms of people like Sergei Witte and Pyotr Stolypin, but there's still huge economic development challenges facing Russia. And the kind of umbrella of all of this desire for modernization, remember, that comes from Alexander II, is rescinded a little bit by his son Alexander III and Nicholas II. Is this drive for modernisation, but modernisation without political participation, modernisation without democracy. But we do see tremendous industrial growth in Russia at this time before the First World War. Remember, though, that's largely because Russia is catching up with everybody else, not because they're storming ahead. And we also see changes as people in society, as people move from the countryside to take jobs in factories in towns and cities. So Russia is a country in flux in 1914. It's Morris and Murphy has a good summary of this on pages 43 to 45, if you can have a look at that. And I think what you need to think about is the kind of the positives for Russia at this time as well as the weaknesses. You know, the autocratic system. Remember, the Romanovs celebrate 300 years as the rule of Russia in 1913. You know, Nicholas, certainly for all his weaknesses and failings as the Tsar of Russia, certainly doesn't think that it's a reckless pursuit when he goes to war. And there's those telegrams between himself and his cousin Wilhelm of Germany trying to avoid war. So Nicholas is aware of what he's getting into. It isn't a reckless choice. Think back to what Europe was like in 1914. Russia as that protector of the Slavic peoples, and Austria-Hungary, the country that it tended to have the most disputes with of this nature. And remember, Austria had moved into control Bosnia in 1908, and that's really now a beginning of a tension between them that had existed for much longer. So Russia's got a lot at stake with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. There is that idea of pan-Slavism, of Russia as protector of the Slavs. But we've also seen over the past 50, 60 years this kind of swing of Russian foreign policy, sort of searching for success, whether that's in South and Central Asia, the disasters of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 and 1906, and also those earlier struggles against Turkey. Think about the Russo-Turkish War in 1877 and 1878, where although Russia wins, probably doesn't do as well as they think they should, and of course the disaster of the Crimean War. Militarily, Russia isn't in disastrously bad shape in 1914. Remember, their navy, both their navies, the Baltic and the Pacific Fleet, have been destroyed by the Japanese, but they're not in too bad a shape. And Norman Stone, in his book on the Eastern Front, can give you some more of those military details there. So when Russia goes to war in 1914, like many of the countries that are involved in the conflict, it's a wildly popular decision. You can see, you know, photographs of people cheering and screaming their delights, as there were similar scenes in Berlin, London and Paris, as well as in St. Petersburg, which will change its name during the war because it sounds too German and it will become Petrograd. So there's that idea, nationalism, patriotism. There's this idea that kind of grips Nicholas quite fiercely, that, you know, Russia's great power status is at stake, and the other European great powers will end up being involved in this war. Britain's role, remember, is not so certain, but certainly France, Germany and Austria, will. So there's that feeling as well, and they somehow have to atone for the damage that was done by the Japanese in 1905. Lenin, needless to say, is not amused by what's going on, and certainly he will be very vocal, as he is throughout. So this is from the Oxley book on Russia. And again, a fear, and I would suggest to you not just in Russia, but definitely in Britain and Germany as well, was this idea of the working classes of Europe fighting the working classes on behalf of the nobility. And that's an idea that, you know, if you've seen the film Dr. Zhivago, it also comes through clearly in that, and a couple of scenes there, but in the original at least. I haven't seen the modern one. So there is this idea amongst the workers' activists, the revolutionaries, that this is a war of the old social order, and these socialist ideas, and particularly the Bolsheviks, will work hard throughout the entire Russian war effort to get activists into frontline battalions, start talking to people, start spreading the word, and begin to kind of sow seeds of dissent within the Russian army. The Soviets are formed in 1905, and remember, they will mostly made up of factory workers and representatives of the military, particularly the army, and they will form a key role during this time period. The war for Russia is a disaster on many fronts. The Russian idea, they have this kind of idea of the Russian steamroller, this huge peasant army will just kind of march along and knock down all front of it. And faced with the superior technology and military organisation of the Germans, that certainly isn't the case. The equipment is terrible. They have terrible problems with the shortages. They have huge problems domestically, and it will be food in the cities that causes some of the riots in that winter of discontent of 1916 into 1917. There's food shortages. Those productive young peasants, those young men are called up to fight. Many of them willingly volunteer, of course, in patriotic enthusiasm. As a result, those people go off, they leave the farmland and go to the countryside in order to, go to the front line in order to fight. Food prices will increase by 500%, and inflation will be a perennial problem throughout the First World War for Russia. There's also transport problems. Remember, despite the incredible advances that have been made in the transport infrastructure of Russia under Witte in particular, rolling stock is taken up by the military, and there's food shortages as well. So a recipe for lots and lots of issues to come. There's two disastrous battles, the Battle of Masurian Lakes and at Tannenberg, where the Germans really show their absolute kind of military might. As a result, on the 22nd of August 1915, Nicholas takes purse control of the Russian armies. I mean, clearly, perhaps as a man, he might not have been suited to the demands of this task, but at the same time, he sees his honour as the Emperor of Russia at stake. He is still venerated by the soldiers, and many of the Russian soldiers are still very happy to see him. He's also seen as a moderating influence. He sees it as an act of duty and patriotism, but certainly now, for his personal integrity, he's also going to be personally associated with the challenge and setbacks that Russia will face during the war. In 1916, there is the Brusilov offensive, a Russian offensive against the Austrian army, which is apparently very successful at first. The challenge comes for Brusilov, really, who's by now commander-in-chief of the Russian armies, that they push too quickly into one part and they don't have the logistical support to back it up. While Nicholas is away, the Progressive Bloc would suggest to him that they form a cabinet in order to run Russia during his absence. This is not to Nicholas's taste at all, and if you recall from the fundamental laws that he published in April 1906, he made it very clear that his wife would take on the role if there was no suitable man to do it, and clearly his son is too young and too sick to do so. So the Progressive Bloc is out of the picture, much to Rodzianko's and the other politicians' frustrations, and certainly Rodzianko will work furiously to try and kind of maintain and try and keep a grip on what's going on here. Instead, Nicholas makes the disastrous decision to appoint his German-born wife to manage Russia. She, of course, is under the heady influence of Rasputin. Both Westwood and Figes have got some quite nice writing on this. Remember, she's obsessed by the health of her son. Rasputin is able to seemingly address that need in terms of healing or calming the boy. But of course, her erratic behaviour combined with his means a kind of revolving door of ministers and general chaos in Russia, which would have been there anyway, regardless of who was in charge. By the winter of 1916, then, the cold, the food prices, the inflation, everything comes to a head in the spring of 1917, the early spring, centered around the strikes at the Putilov Steelworks and also International Women's Day. We have marches on the streets, and we have a mutiny in the Petrograd garrison where those soldiers refuse to fire on the protesters. And it's that situation where Alexandra and also Rodzianko, although Nicholas is not a fan of Rodzianko, Alexandra calls Nicholas back to St. Petersburg to address these key problems. And of course, it's while he's on the train coming back to St. Petersburg that he's unable to get any further and is forced to abdicate in the train carriage in March 1917. So one of the key things to think about is those long-term and short-term causes of the revolution, the impact of the war itself, how the war, exacerbates. Maybe, you don't want to get into counterfactual history, but just to think on a little bit more about what additional problems the war causes and what are those kind of long-term slow burn problems in Russia that are also exacerbated by the First World War. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope it was useful.